My brother and I used to be really close, especially when we were younger. Our favorite activity was playing with our Hot Wheels cars in the basement of our house. The basement was a typical unfinished space, full of dust and cobwebs, but it was our little kingdom. We had a big old piece of plywood set up on some cinder blocks as our play table. We'd spend hours there, racing and crashing our cars, making up stories and adventures. One day, we decided to make a new track for our cars. We found some old pieces of cardboard and duct tape and got to work. After a while, we had a pretty impressive track laid out, complete with ramps and tunnels. We were so proud of it and couldn't wait to start racing. As we played, I noticed something strange. One of the cars, a red Camaro, kept disappearing. We'd put it on the track, watch it race around a few times, and then it would just vanish. At first, we thought it was just getting lost in the clutter of the basement, but after searching for it several times, we couldn't find it anywhere. We started to get frustrated. How could a toy car just disappear like that? We tore the basement apart, looking under boxes and behind shelves, but it was nowhere to be found. Eventually, we gave up and went back to playing with the other cars. The next day, the red Camaro was back on the track, as if it had never been gone. We laughed it off and continued playing, but the same thing happened again. The car would disappear only to reappear later in the same spot. This went on for a few weeks, and it started to freak us out. We told our parents, but they just brushed it off as our imaginations running wild. We even tried to catch it in the act, watching the car closely as we played, but it always disappeared when we weren't looking. One evening, as we were finishing up our play session, we heard a noise coming from the other side of the basement. It sounded like something moving, like footsteps. We froze, our eyes wide with fear. Slowly, we turned to look, but there was nothing there. The noise stopped, and we tried to convince ourselves it was just the house settling. But deep down, we knew something wasn't right. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the basement. The next day, we decided to set up a trap. We placed the red Camaro in the center of the track and surrounded it with some of our other cars, hoping to catch whatever was taking it. We waited and watched, but nothing happened. Frustrated, we left the basement and went outside to play. When we came back, the red Camaro was gone again. This time we noticed something even stranger. The other cars we had placed around it were also slightly moved as if someone had pushed them aside. We were officially creeped out. After that, we stopped playing in the basement as much. The red Camaro continued to disappear and reappear, but we tried to ignore it. Eventually, we moved out of that house, and the mystery of the disappearing car was left behind. To this day, my brother and I still talk about it sometimes, trying to come up with explanations. Was it a ghost, a mischievous spirit, or just our imaginations playing tricks on us? We'll probably never know for sure. All I know is that something strange was happening in that basement, and it still gives me chills to think about it. I've always been a rational person, never one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural. However, one night changed my perspective forever. My family had just moved into an old Victorian house in a small town. The house was beautiful, with intricate woodwork and stained glass windows. Despite its charm, it had an eerie feeling, especially at night. The previous owners had left behind some old furniture, including a grand piano in the living room. It was a beautiful piece, though slightly out of tune, and I loved to play it in the evenings. One night I was alone in the house. My parents had gone out for a dinner party, and my younger brother was at a friend's house. I decided to spend some time playing the piano. As I played, I noticed a strange feeling as if someone was watching me. I brushed it off, thinking it was just my imagination. After about an hour, I decided to take a break. I stood up and stretched, but then I heard a noise behind me. It was a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. I turned around, but there was no one there. I felt a chill run down my spine. Trying to stay calm, I convinced myself it was just the wind or the house settling. I sat back down and started playing again. A few minutes later, I heard the whisper again, this time louder and clearer. It was a woman's voice, though I couldn't make out what she was saying. I froze, my fingers hovering above the keys. The whisper continued, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Gathering my courage, I slowly turned around. There, standing in the doorway, was a woman. She was dressed in an old-fashioned Victorian-style gown, her face pale and her eyes sad. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The woman raised a finger to her lips as if to shush me, and then she vanished. I sat there in stunned silence, my mind racing. Had I just seen a ghost? I wasn't sure what to think. I ran upstairs to my room and locked the door, my hands shaking. I tried to call my parents, but there was no signal. I was alone in the house with a ghost, and I had no idea what to do. I sat on my bed, staring at the door, half expecting the woman to appear again. Hours passed, but nothing happened. Finally, I heard my parents' car pull into the driveway. I rushed downstairs and told them what had happened. They looked at me with concern, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. They suggested I had just been imagining things, but I knew what I had seen. After that night, I couldn't go near the piano without feeling a sense of dread. The woman never appeared again, but I could still feel her presence in the house. I started to do some research on the history of the house and found out that a woman had died there under mysterious circumstances in the early 1900s. Her name was Margaret, and she had been a talented pianist. The piano in our living room had been hers. The more I learned about Margaret, the more I felt connected to her. I began to understand that she wasn't trying to scare me, she was just lonely. She wanted someone to acknowledge her presence, to know her story. I still play the piano sometimes, but now I always keep an eye on the doorway, half expecting to see Margaret standing there listening. I used to work as a night guard at a local museum. The job was simple: walk around the exhibits, check that everything was in place, and make sure no one broke in. The museum was small, and I was usually the only one there at night. It was a quiet job, and I liked the solitude. One night I was making my rounds when I heard a noise coming from the ancient Egypt exhibit. It was a soft shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet. I stopped and listened, but the noise had ceased. I walked over to the exhibit, my flashlight beam sweeping over the sarcophagi and statues. Everything seemed in order, so I continued on my way. A few minutes later, I heard the sound again. This time it was louder and accompanied by a faint whispering. I turned around, my heart pounding. The noise was coming from behind one of the sarcophagi. I slowly approached, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I got closer, the whispering grew louder, but I still couldn't make out the words. I reached the sarcophagus and shone my light behind it. There was nothing there. I stood there, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself it was just the wind or my imagination playing tricks on me. I continued my rounds, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every so often I would hear the shuffling and whispering, always coming from the ancient Egypt exhibit. By the end of my shift, I was a nervous wreck. I was glad to see the sunrise and the morning guard arrive. The next night I was dreading going back to work. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. I started my rounds, trying to stay as far away from the Egypt exhibit as possible. However, halfway through my shift, I heard the shuffling again. This time it was louder and more insistent. The whispering was clearer too, but I still couldn't understand the words. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I decided to confront whatever it was. I marched over to the exhibit, flashlight in hand. The shuffling stopped as I approached, and the whispering faded to silence. I stood in front of the sarcophagus, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer. I shone my light around the exhibit, but there was no one there. Just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A shadowy figure, standing behind one of the statues. It was tall and thin, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through me. I froze, unable to move or speak. The figure stared at me for what felt like an eternity before slowly fading away. I stood there, my mind reeling. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I ran out of the exhibit and didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face. I never went back to that job. I couldn't. The fear was too much. I still don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was a ghost, or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. All I know is that I never want to experience anything like that again. The museum is still there, and I sometimes wonder if the new night guard has had any similar experiences, but I will never go back to find out. I'm a 21-year-old girl, and my story is about a stalker who kept coming to my workplace late at night. I worked part-time at a clothing store, which I won't name. I had been working there for almost a month and was still getting the hang of things. My shift was from 7 p.m. to 12 a.m., which meant I would close the store. Fortunately, the store policy was to always have 2 or more people closing, so we wouldn't be alone, especially since it was just us girls working there. The only man was my manager, who was rarely in. On my shift were my closest friend Shannon, a new girl named Katie, and the assistant manager Hannah. Shannon was vacuuming in the clothing department, Hannah was in the back dealing with shipments, and Katie was cleaning out the dressing rooms and putting away clothes. I was stationed at the front, where the cash registers are, and unfortunately I was alone. I didn't mind being up there by myself. I liked the peace and quiet since we didn't have many customers late at night. I'm very anxious and usually try not to make eye contact with people, often giving an awkward smile. Hannah brought up some new clothes that needed tagging and then returned to the back. I began tagging when a man walked in. He wore a light gray t-shirt, dark jeans, flip-flops, and a baseball cap. I greeted him with the usual welcome to the store and went back to tagging. The man took this as an invitation to come and talk to me. He leaned on the glass showcases at the counter. I asked if I could help him, and he requested to know where the men's beanies were, which we didn't sell. I informed him, and he nodded, then fell silent, staring at me as I tagged clothes. I got uncomfortable but kept tagging, hoping he would go away. Minutes passed before he suddenly said my name. Hearing my name from his mouth creeped me out. I looked over nervously and asked if I could help him. By this time, he had been in the store for nearly an hour. He asked how hard my job was and how many days off I got. I told him it wasn't too hard, and I didn't get many days off due to a lack of workers. He asked if I wanted to leave work and do a little something together that creeped me out to the point I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I told him I had a boyfriend, which was true. He then got enraged, yelling, "Really? That's how you're gonna be?" The other girls heard the commotion and came up front. The man stormed out, but not before showing me a knife in his pocket. I started hyperventilating and crying. Shannon grabbed my hands, concerned, while Hannah asked what happened. I couldn't get my words out, just cried harder. Shannon took me to the back and held me. Hannah told me I could leave early. It was 11:30 p.m. I thanked her, grabbed my purse from my locker, and said my goodbyes. Cautiously, I walked to my car, only to see the same man sitting on the hood, twirling the blade. My knees turned to noodles, and I ran back inside, screaming for Hannah to lock the doors. She questioned why, and I pointed to my car. She saw him, cursed under her breath, locked the doors, set the alarms, and called the police. When the police arrived, they found only stab marks on my car and a cut brake line. I don't work at that store anymore. For the past 6 years, I've been self-employed, mowing lawns, doing landscaping, pulling up roots and stumps and things like that. For the first few years, I would go door to door, knocking or leaving my business card, hoping people wanted some lawn service. If they already had someone, maybe I could offer a better rate. I can tell you now just how competitive that sort of business is, especially in the South. You see, down here, a lot of folks take pride in lawn care and farm care. When they get a tree that needs cutting down, they like to do it themselves. When they've got acres of land in need of some brush hogging, they do it themselves too, more often than not. So for the first few years, my jobs were few and far between. Revenue was low, and contracts were slow to come in. I cut prices as much as I could. I'd go door to door every day, hoping that I wasn't just bothering people. This story in particular is one I've wanted to tell for a while, but as I'm someone who doesn't really have people in my life, like friends or close family members, I didn't really have anyone to talk to. So it's nice to have some place to share. This is actually the story of what got my business off the ground. I finally found a farmer who did not want to mow and clear his own land. He had purchased a few acres away from his own farmland, so there was a gap of forest between his new land and his current land. He wasn't too happy about this because the bid he'd placed for the land in between was being delayed. I don't know what that means or how bids get delayed or how that works, but that sucks for him. But because I lived closer to the plot of land that he wanted to clear out, and because he was already busy with his crops on his current land, he decided to contract me to mow and clear the land there. That would entail brush hogging several acres, cutting down some trees, and uprooting a bunch of stumps, all of which I know how to do and do quite well. The week came when I would be fulfilling this contract. My plan was to get it all done within 5 days. Immediately upon arriving there, I noticed something weird. A good 50 yards or so of the land had been cleared already. It looked like someone started to clear it and just changed their mind. If I had to guess, it looked like the farmer did it. Maybe he stopped when he realized he didn't have time to do it himself. I just went with that and started my work. As I had 2 or 3 other clients during the day, I usually ended up out here around 6 p.m., just before it got really dark. I would work well into the morning too, usually leaving around 4 a.m. I worked myself to the bone so that I'd not only get the contract done in time, but I'd also have a spare day to make sure everything looked great. If you're thinking that doing all this at night is a bad idea, it was well away from any other people living out there, and I'm talking miles. They wouldn't even hear me in the distance. Plus, I had a couple of spotlights that I could set up before I started working. The first night was the roughest. I had tall grass next to me alongside as I ran. I could tell just how much faster it was than me, and I couldn't help but wonder why it never lapped out and dragged me away. It could if it wanted to, but I made it to my truck. I flung open the door, slammed it shut, turned the key in the ignition, and drove home. There I sat in the dark interior of my truck, my ankle severely bruised, even further behind on my contract that I had to finish, or I wouldn't be able to pay my bills. A grown man nearly in tears. What was wrong with me? I brainstormed the entire drive home, praying that there weren't any cops at the regular speed traps because I wasn't driving right at all, not in that panicked state. But my racing mind finally led me to an idea: my brother. My brother lived a couple of towns over, about an hour away, so it wasn't too close, but I was desperate more than ever. I gave him a call that night. I apologized because he had been sleeping. Then I asked him if he'd join me on a job. I offered him half of the pay of the contract to help me finish it out, but I never told him the other half of his duty to just be there and make me feel safe. You see, my brother had a sidearm and a concealed carry permit, so I would certainly feel safer with him being there. With double the manpower, I was able to finish up the grass the next day and clear out nearly all the stumps. I had to sacrifice half my pay, but I really did appreciate my brother coming by. Now, toward the end of that day, we had the choice of staying overtime to just finish it up and call it quits for good, or coming back the next day for a half day. In my head, doing a half day the next day meant a little bit more daytime to finish up, but then again, the idea of just getting it done that night felt better. So that's what we decided to do. We worked until about 5 a.m., and the worst that happened then was my brother coming to me when I had my headphones in and asking me what those weird sounds were. And yeah, it was the same sounds, the shrill cries that were rat-like. And now I know they weren't from a rat. I told him it was just a bird. He went back to work, not really interested in knowing what kind of bird it was. When we were finally done, we went over to Waffle House and celebrated. But my stomach was queasy. The idea that I'd put my brother in danger too, just because I wanted to feel better, made me feel a bit guilty. Maybe I'll share this story with him soon. I hope he takes it well. And I hope that farmer's out there and he's doing okay. Last I heard from him, that hole that I'd packed got dug into and is open for business once again. I'm a security officer for a company in Southern California. We work alongside the sheriff's department in the cities we service. As a patrol officer, my job is essentially the same as a police officer, unlike your typical observe and report security guards. We respond to calls ranging from simple trespassing to burglary, domestic abuse, kidnapping, and even shots fired, hence the officer in the title. I've been in several foot and vehicle pursuits, which is why we work closely with the local sheriff's offices. Now that you know what we do, let me get to the story. I used to work the late shift before switching to days. This story happened while I was working from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I remember driving around the city in my patrol vehicle, listening to our two-way radio for any calls, when I got one in my district. It was a burglary alarm on the north side of the city, out in the desert. It must have been around 1 in the morning when I was sent to check it out. As soon as I pulled onto the street leading to the property, I rolled in dark, which means I shut off all the lights. The building used to be an onion packaging factory with hangars on the west side of the property, but now it was abandoned, and we were contracted to watch it. I've been in there alone many times when I checked it twice a night, but I never had an experience until this night. Keep in mind that the property does not have working lights at all. I pulled onto the west side of the property, visually inspecting the exterior perimeter when I observed a slightly open door. I keyed up on my radio Lincoln 1 to control, dispatch. Go ahead, this is Lincoln 1. Be advised I have an open door on the west side of the hangars. Can you roll an additional unit to my location and stand by my vehicle? I smoked a cigarette under the drizzle that is rare for Southern California. I liked the rain, though the wind was also blowing pretty hard that night, from what I remember. About 5 minutes later, my partner arrived, who also happens to be my good friend outside of work. We pulled our guns and flashlights and went inside. The first thing you always notice when entering is the stench of onions. It was so pungent that you could taste it through your nose. The hangars we were clearing were huge, dark, empty, and filled with that rotten smell. This is where things got creepy. We could hear the light drizzle hit the sheet metal and the wind blowing through whatever cracks it found. Then it happened. We heard footsteps on the roof of the hangars. I looked at my partner and said, "What the heck? These hangars don't have access to the roof." "How did they get up there?" he replied. "I don't know, call it in Lincoln 1 to control. Be advised we hear footsteps on the roof. We are code 6, 10 to 23 until further." Which pretty much means we're out on investigation and to stand by until further notice. Dispatch acknowledged, and we walked through the building, checking all corners until we got outside. We checked the perimeter of the building, and just like I thought, there was no access to the roof. Plus, it was raining. Who the heck would be up there anyway? We put it off as the wind. We checked everything possible and called it Code 4, meaning the area was clear. However, to this day, my partner and I still talk about it. Huffing and gasping for air, I arrived at work and told my coworker what had just happened. He didn't look surprised, but rather concerned. He told me that another coworker had seen the same creature recently and had described it exactly as I had, down to the last detail. Needless to say, I am never walking to work in the dark again. From now on, I'll just call an Uber. As a security officer in Southern California, I work alongside the sheriff's department in the cities we service. My job as a patrol officer is essentially the same as that of a police officer. We respond to calls ranging from simple trespassers to burglary, domestic abuse, kidnapping, and shots fired. I've been in a few foot and vehicle pursuits. That's just how we operate, which is why we work with the local sheriff's offices. One night, while working the late shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., I received a burglary alarm call in my district. It was around 1 a.m. when I was sent to check it out. The location was an old onion packaging factory, now abandoned, out in the desert on the north side of the city. As I pulled onto the street leading to the property, I turned off all the lights on my patrol vehicle. The factory had no working lights, and the stench of onions was overwhelming. As I inspected the exterior perimeter, I noticed a slightly open door. I radioed for backup and waited under the light drizzle. My partner arrived about 5 minutes later. We drew our guns and flashlights and entered the hangar. The building was huge, dark, and filled with the pungent smell of rotten onions. As we walked through the hangar, we heard footsteps on the roof. We were baffled because there was no access to the roof, and it was raining. We reported the situation to dispatch and continued our investigation. After checking everything, we concluded that the noise was probably just the wind. Nonetheless, the experience was unnerving, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. As I made my way to the break room, huffing and gasping for air, I told my coworker what had just happened. He didn't look so much surprised as he did concerned and informed me that another coworker had seen the same creature recently. He described it exactly as I had, every last detail. Needless to say, I'm never going to walk to work in the dark again. From now on, I'll just call an Uber. I'm a security officer for a company in Southern California. We work alongside the sheriff's department in the cities that we service. As a patrol officer, my job is essentially the same as that of a police officer. Unlike your typical observe and report security guards, we respond to calls ranging from simple trespassers to burglary, domestic abuse, kidnapping, and shots fired. hence the officer in the title. I've been in a couple of foot and vehicle pursuits. That's just the way we operate, which is why we work alongside the local sheriff's offices. Now that you know what we do, let me get to the story. I used to work the late beat before being switched to days. When this story happened, I was working from 2200 to 0600 in the morning. I remember driving around the city in my patrol vehicle, listening to our two-way radio for any calls when I got one in my district. It was a burglary alarm on the north side of the city, out in the desert. It had to be around 1 in the morning when I was sent to check it out. As soon as I pulled into the street leading to the property, I rolled in dark, which just means I shut off all the lights. The building used to be an onion packaging factory with hangars on the west side of the property, but now it was abandoned and we were contracted to watch it. I had been in there alone many times, checking it twice a night, but never had an experience until this night. Keep in mind that the property does not have working lights at all. Anyway, I pulled onto the west side of the property, visually inspecting the exterior perimeter when I observed a slightly open door. I keyed up on my radio Lincoln 1 to control dispatch. Go ahead. This is Lincoln 1. Be advised, I have an open door on the west side of the hangars. Can you roll an additional unit to my location? I stood by my vehicle, smoking a cigarette under the drizzle, which is rare for Southern California. I liked the rain though. The wind was also blowing pretty hard that night from what I remember. About 5 minutes later, my partner arrived, who also happens to be my really good friend outside of work. We pulled our guns and flashlights and went inside. The first thing you always notice when entering is the stench of onion. I mean, it was so pungent that you could taste it through your nose. The hangars we were clearing are huge, dark, empty, and filled with that rotten smell. This is where things get creepy. We could hear the light drizzle hit the sheet metal, the wind blowing through whatever cracks they found, and then it happened. We heard footsteps on the roof of the hangars. I looked at my partner and said, "What the heck? These hangars don't have access to the roof." "How did they get up there?" He replied, "I don't know." "Call it in." Lincoln 1 to control. Be advised, we hear footsteps on the roof. We are code 610 to 23 until further notice, which pretty much means we're out on investigation. Stand by until further notice. Dispatch acknowledged, and we walked through the building, checking all corners until we got outside. We checked the perimeter of the building, and just like I thought, there was no access to the roof. Plus, it was raining. Who the heck would be up there anyway? We put it off on the wind. We checked everything possible and called it Code 4, which means no further action needed. We left the property, but that night stuck with me. It wasn't the first time I had experienced something unexplainable on the job, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. A few years ago, I worked the late shift at a city center club. The job wasn't particularly frightening, except for the state of the girls' toilets at the end of the night. One incident, however, will stay with me for the rest of my life. This story has two parts, one considerably scarier than the other. One night, close to closing time, I was cleaning out the ice wells and organizing bottles of spirits. A group of people was drinking and dancing nearby, and a moody-looking couple stood against the wall. A younger lad came to the bar, ordered a drink, and tried chatting with the couple. The moody guy was clearly not interested, but the young lad didn't take the hint because he was drunk and in a good mood. The young lad eventually moved on when the moody guy started telling him to get lost. The moody couple finished their drinks and looked like they were leaving. As they passed the younger lad, he waved goodbye, possibly saying something snarky. The moody guy suddenly rushed him and gave him a weak punch. The young lad avoided trouble by ducking out of the way. I instructed one of the younger staff to ensure the couple was escorted out. I thought the situation was over. About 15 minutes later, I went out for a smoke and was shocked to see the young lad with a huge slash on his head, bleeding heavily. People were panicking, trying to keep pressure on the wound and looking out for an ambulance. It was like a scene from a war movie. The door staff asked me to get some paper towels to help stem the bleeding. The young lad was trembling and saying he felt cold, which was chilling since it was a mild autumn night. The next day, I called a friend who sometimes sold me marijuana, telling him about the incident. To my surprise, he knew about it because the injured kid, David, was his boss's little brother. His boss was a big-time dealer in the area, running a serious drug operation under the cover of legitimate businesses. My friend assured me that David was alive but in bad shape. A few days later, I received a call from an unknown number. A guy who worked for the big-time dealer wanted to talk. I thought it would be a phone call, but he arrived at my place and asked me to drive to the dealer's flat. The flat was luxurious, and the dealer, Paul, asked me to tell the police I saw a knife, even though I hadn't. The police needed a stronger case against the attacker, and I agreed to help. Months later, I thought the ordeal was over, but I received another call from an unknown number. This time, when I went to Paul's place, it was filled with mean-looking guys. They showed me CCTV stills from a bar I didn't recognize and asked if I could identify the attacker. After looking through many images, I recognized a guy with strawberry blonde hair. I told Paul, and the room went quiet. Paul drove me home without saying much, which was terrifying. I realized I had condemned a man to a horrible fate, knowing that Paul and his gang would seek revenge. It haunts me to this day, and I try not to think about it. I used to work the night shift at a gas station on the side of some highway in the country. From the hours of 12 a.m. to 6 a.m., the road was pretty dead. I would have maybe one or two people come in to pay cash in a whole night. It was a very boring and depressing job, especially doing the graveyard shift, but I had just finished college and needed to pay off my loans. The only reason I kept this job was because my boss threw me an extra $5 an hour for doing the night shift. On this one cold December night, I was doing my usual thing, reading the newspaper, playing games on my phone, and whatnot when I noticed the headlights of a car pulling off the highway into the parking lot. It was a red pickup truck. Somebody stepped out and shut the door. I went back to reading the paper as I saw that he was standing by the gas pump. I assumed he wasn't paying cash. I looked up a few moments later and saw that he was still standing in the same position, staring at the gas pump. I almost felt obligated to go out and help him. He was obviously confused. I felt a cold chill run up my spine as I saw the 6-foot-something tall man slowly turn his head to face me. I couldn't make out any features of his face, but I knew he was staring at me. I tried to pretend I didn't notice by going back to reading the paper. Of course, I wasn't really reading now. I was a bit shaken by the guy out there. I just wanted him to pay debit or credit and leave. I looked up and gasped as the man was now much closer to the front door of the building. It wouldn't have been so disturbing if it weren't for the fact that he wasn't moving. He was just standing still as before, still looking in my direction. I walked over to the door to get a closer look. All I could see in his face was still blackness. I locked the door and flipped the open sign to closed. Locking the door without proper cause could possibly get me in trouble, but I was not taking a chance because, quite frankly, I was scared shitless. I walked back behind the counter and sat down on one of the containers on the floor, just so I couldn't see the man outside anymore. I stayed in that position for a good 5 minutes, texting every friend I had to see who was awake. I was desperate to tell somebody about this. When I finally got up to check that he was gone, I let out a full scream as the man was now right outside the door. I picked up the phone on the counter and called the police. The operator was reluctant to send somebody over because of the way I described the situation, but I persuaded them. I hid behind the counter, balled up like a child. I began to hear heavy thumps at the door, not innocent knocks to catch my attention. I mean thuds and thumps trying to break down the door. And then, eventually it finally stopped. I heard the sound of a car starting outside and then driving off. I looked outside and he was gone. A patrol cop, along with a state trooper, pulled into the parking lot. I reported the red pickup truck and told them which direction I thought he went in. I couldn't describe his face as all I saw was blackness. Of course, there wasn't much the police could do as the man didn't really do anything. I left that job a few months later for a job in the city. Two years ago, I was called in to do the night shift from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. at 7-Eleven since somebody called out. The store was located on a busy road in a rather quiet and rural area. During the night shift, you could expect anywhere from 10 to 20 people to come in to buy beer or something else. This one particular night, there was this one guy, mid-20s, that came in. He started making weird noises, like loud yelling noises. I assumed he had some kind of mental disability. In fact, my brother has a mental disability, so I immediately felt sympathy for the guy. He walked up to the counter without any items, with his head facing me but his eyes looking up at the ceiling. I felt uncomfortable. I honestly didn't know how to deal with it. I tried speaking with him, but he only responded in loud noises. I kept checking if he was with someone outside, but he was alone. There weren't any cars in the parking lot, so I assumed he walked. He stood there for so long, looking up at the ceiling and making noises, that I tried to get him out by handing him a bag of chips and telling him he could go. I tried finding some kind of number to call for someone to help him. Then, out of nowhere, he finally turned around and walked out of the store. I felt so horrible for the man, but at the same time I felt a bit creeped out. About an hour later, the phone on the counter rang. I picked up to hear the familiar yelling sounds from the man from earlier. It caught me off guard. I didn't know what to think other than this had to be some kind of prank. I hung up on him and was now becoming paranoid of my surroundings, constantly checking the outside through the windows. Come 4 o'clock, the person working after me came in, finally allowing me to go home. It wasn't my problem anymore. I got home and threw all my stuff on the table, ready to get to sleep, but my phone rang within a minute after entering the door. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why would someone be calling at 4 a.m.? I could only imagine it was bad news. I braced myself and picked up the phone. It was the man again. I felt sick to my stomach as I listened to the loud noises he made. I struggled to slam the phone back to the receiver. All night, I felt like I was being watched, even with all the blinds shut. I could swear I heard strange noises coming from all over my house. I refused to get any sleep until the sun came up. Weeks passed, and I had forgotten about the incident until one day when I went into the basement for the first time in a while. I found that papers had been scattered all over the floor. When I went into the basement closet, I found writing on the walls. 7-Eleven had been written in Sharpie on the wall, along with the address to the 7-Eleven I worked at and my house address. The most disturbing part was that I also found various kitchen knives along with a large pocket knife sitting in the closet. What started out as seemingly just an innocent person turning into something of a prank ultimately turned into something much more horrifying. He had been living down there for God knows how long, and I'm just grateful that, for whatever reason, he changed his mind and left because I haven't seen or heard from him since. All I can say is that man is dangerously ill. I was working the night shift at my local grocery store, back when it used to be open 24 hours a day. There would normally be less than 10 customers throughout my shift, but I wouldn't get to sit around and do nothing. They wanted me to work on stock when I wasn't helping a customer. It was a bigger store, so often there may have been one other person in the building, whether it be someone working on stock or someone cleaning. This night I was the only one working. I was stocking in the cereal aisle when I heard something fall over on the other side of the shelf in the next aisle over. I would always hear the door to the store sliding open. It was the loudest thing ever, so it caught me off guard that there might have been a customer in the building. Of course, it wasn't weird yet, not until I looked to my left and saw a man standing by the edge of the aisle, shooting me a blank stare. "Do you need something, sir?" I asked him. "No, but could you just point me to the eggs?" he said. He wasn't normal looking. His face looked weird, not exactly ugly, just unusual. His upper lip kind of came out too far, almost like a Simpsons character. I was a bit uncomfortable that I had to deal with ringing him up. I hurried to finish the cereal aisle, and when I was done, I began to bring the U-boat cart to the back room. I was stopped halfway when the same guy cut me off through the middle section of the aisle. I want to note this guy was probably in his mid-30s, and at the time I was only 22, though I looked much younger. The guy stopped me and started trying to make awkward small talk. He started by asking me my name, how old I was, if and where I went to school, and why I was doing the night shift. His questions started to get weirder when he asked me if I went to parties a lot, and if I had a girlfriend. I told him I didn't, and he asked me if I've ever had a boyfriend while putting his hand on my shoulder. I immediately started walking away with the cart, but he followed me. I told him I wasn't into whatever he was thinking about. I went faster and faster, until I finally made it to the storage room. He didn't follow me in. I wasn't supposed to stay back there for extended periods to avoid customer theft. I decided it would be best to just wait for him by the register so that he would ring his stuff up and leave. But I waited there for at least 20 minutes. He never came. I decided he was gone, and whether he stole the eggs or something else, there wasn't anything I could do now. I had to go to the bathroom, so I took a quick jog to the back of the store and into the employee bathroom. Moments after sitting on the toilet, my heart dropped into my stomach as I heard the bathroom door open. I choked the urge to say something like, "You can't be in here," but I didn't want to give away my position. I lifted my legs so that I wouldn't be visible from under the stall. What happened next was simply horrifying. I sat there for the longest time looking at the floor, not moving a muscle. When I finally looked up, I could see an eye peering through the crack of the stall door. I screamed. I knew I was trapped. I knew I had one shot at making a move. I grabbed the box cutter in my pocket and began sliding it through the crack of the door, forcing him to move his eye away. I took that chance to slam the stall door open in his face and hightail it out of the bathroom and all the way out of the store. I called my boss at least 5 times before he finally picked up, and I explained everything. He told me to call the cops, and so I did. Of course, the man wasn't in the store anymore by the time the cops showed up. I only did the night shift twice after that, and luckily didn't see the man again. In 2015, I landed my dream job as a manager of an old, rustic pub with stained glass windows and ornate bar fixtures. However, a big brewery company bought the pub, and within 6 months, I lost my job. Desperate to pay rent and bills, I took a job at an off-license in the town center, working the night shift from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. The off-license was busy, especially on weekends. It had a cash machine, sold expensive booze, and was a popular spot for people to buy drinks after the bars closed. On a busy night, we could have over PS 7,000 in cash on site. One Sunday morning, around 5 a.m., just before Christmas, the store had been extremely busy. It was Black Friday, and there were office parties in town. By the end of the night, I was exhausted and ready to collapse. I rested my head on the counter when I heard the door beep, signaling a customer. A man who seemed alarmingly sober walked in. Most customers at that time were drunk, but this guy was different. He kept his hands in his jacket pockets and greeted me by name, which made me uneasy. He knew where I lived and asked about my family by name. It was creepy. Then 2 other men walked in, also sober, and flanked the first guy. The first man politely asked if there was a toilet in the back of the shop. When I confirmed, he told me to go in, lock the door, and not come out for at least half an hour, showing me something heavy in his jacket. I realized they were robbing the place. They took all the CCTV USB sticks, wrecked the monitors, broke into the safe, and emptied the shelves of premium spirits. All the while I sat in the toilet, terrified and wondering how they knew so much about me